Hello, friends. My name is Jamie, and welcome to another episode of the Mission to Martius podcast. If you are wondering why it sounds like I'm dying, I'm currently recovering from a cold and I had lost my voice, so if you feel inclined to say something about the state of my voice, I would really rather you not. Thank you. Anyway, Mission to Martius is my fantasy adventure audio drama about humans and fairies that I'm currently in the process of developing. The full story synopsis is in the description. All episodes of the Mission to Martius podcast will be linked down below in the podcast playlist. Last episode was about the Clare family, one of the two main families in Mission to Martius. Today's episode is all about the fairies of Renea and their magic. So without further ado, let's get into it. As I always say at the beginning of each of these episodes, Mission to Martius is a story about humans and fairies, and when it comes to talking about the fairies of Renea, I first need to start with the Enchanted Cove. So the Enchanted Cove is one of two fairy kingdoms, if you want to call it that, in Renea. There's the Enchanted Cove and Fey Portum. The Enchanted Cove is the larger of the two and known as the birthplace of fairies. So the story goes that the Enchanted Cove was created by the mage Alma, an essentially godlike being, as a haven for the fairies. Alma is referred to as the mother of fairies and revered by fairies as such, and it's said that she created them in her image. So for several hundred years, fairies lived in the Enchanted Cove in isolation away from the humans of Renea. It's currently unknown as to why this was the case, though many speculate that this was Alma's way of protecting the fairies from the humans, which may not have been entirely unwarranted. When humans first discovered the existence of fairies, they coexisted relatively peacefully, but that changed when the humans sought after the fairies' magic and invaded the Enchanted Cove. Originally, the humans didn't understand that magic is something that fairies just innately have. It's not something that can be transferred or taught, but the humans were not satisfied with that and hungered for the fairies' power. This led to a period known as the Age of Fairy Hunters. I've mentioned this before in a previous episode, but fairy hunters weren't primarily an organized group. Sure, there were fairy hunters who would form groups and alliances, but different fairy hunters had different goals and motivations for hunting fairies. The common thread between most fairy hunters was that they felt entitled to fairy magic, but again, their exact goals often diverged. Some fairy hunters captured and conducted experiments on fairies in an attempt to harness their magic for themselves. These experiments were unsuccessful and often resulted in the deaths of the fairies who were being experimented on. Other fairy hunters realized that it wasn't possible for them to personally access fairy magic, so instead they would capture fairies and force them to perform labor for them as a way to exploit their power that way. And then, sort of in that same vein but different, there were fairy hunters who knew that they couldn't access fairy magic for themselves, but they killed fairies because they felt threatened by their power, and because they knew that they couldn't get that power for themselves, they were afraid of fairies taking over. This is not to say that all humans were fairy hunters. There were humans that were allies to the fairies in helping them escape from fairy hunters. It became very clear very quickly what areas of Renea were safe for fairies and which weren't. There were kingdoms like Harmonia that offered a safe haven from the fairy hunters and outlawed fairy hunting within those kingdoms, although this didn't prevent fairies from being wary of these offers because many feared that the human kingdoms, not so much as a whole entity, but that humans within those kingdoms might sell them out to fairy hunters, or that the kingdoms themselves would persecute them. And then you have a kingdom like Martius, which openly and proudly align themselves with various fairy hunter groups. We will talk about this more when I do the episode about Martius. But so human sentiments towards fairies really differed depending on where you were in Renea at this time. You had humans who feared fairy magic and wanted to eliminate all fairies. You had humans who felt that fairies should be allowed to coexist with humans, whether that be solely in the Enchanted Cove or other parts of Renea. You also had humans who worshipped fairies, who perceived them as gods because of their magic. As a side note, the majority of humans in Renea are agnostic, but there is a sizable amount of humans that, again, either worship fairies like gods because they believe that humans were created by fairies. Some worship Alma, like most fairies do, and others believe that there must have been another mage or mages or other godlike equivalents that created humans and Renea. The age of fairy hunters spanned roughly 100 years, and during this period, fairies were constantly on the run from the fairy hunters. Fairies did retaliate and fight back against the fairy hunters, but it wasn't until the Human-Fairy War that the fairies came together under a collective resistance. The resistance had retaken and set up base in the Enchanted Cove. The resistance was led by 10 of the most powerful fairies of the time. The Human-Fairy War lasted for 10 years, with the fairy resistance and their human allies ultimately winning the war because they were just more organized and united, again, because the fairy hunters never fully came together as a collective. There was a lot of infighting and disorganization, though there were significant losses on both sides. The end of the Human-Fairy War outlawed fairy hunting across Renea, and the resistance leaders would form the Enchanted Cove Council as it's known today, which I will talk about more in the next episode. Now that I've given you guys a brief rundown of fairy history, I had to be careful about spoilers, so that's why it was briefer than you might expect. I want to get into fairy magic. In Renea, there are two kinds of energy: internal energy and nature energy. All living creatures in Renea have internal energy: humans, fairies, animals. Internal energy comes from the soul, it's what makes things alive. Nature energy, as the name implies, comes from nature and the environment. But unlike internal energy, nature energy can only be found in the environment and fairies. Humans do not naturally have nature energy. It is why they do not have magic. There are 8 elements of nature energy: darkness, fire, flora, ice, earth, water, light, and storm. The coexistence of internal and nature energies in fairies is what gives them their wings and their magic. This magic allows fairies to perform spells and extends their lifespans by several hundred years in comparison to their human counterparts. That isn't to say that fairies are unable to die sooner, as seen during the period of fairy hunters and the Human-Fairy War, and as you'll continue to see throughout the story. But if they are in good health and their circumstances allow, fairies can live to around 600 years old. Fairy wings are a physical manifestation of the presence of internal and nature energy, and in order for fairies to perform spells, they must balance their internal and nature energy throughout their bodies. Fairies can naturally fly because their wings are, again, literal manifestations of the balance of internal and nature energy, but any additional spells must be manually balanced. It's important to note that fairies who struggle to balance their internal and nature energy throughout their bodies tend to experience fatigue and a lack of stamina when performing spells. For example, Lily Griffin, one of our main characters, as a fairy who is missing a leg, she has to orient herself and balance her energies differently than fairies who have all of their limbs. It would be the same case if a fairy was missing any other limb or missing their wings. A fairy missing their wings is particularly difficult for 2 main reasons. First, the act of removing a fairy's wings is very painful, excruciatingly painful for said fairy. And second, a fairy's wings are a major source of their internal and external energy. However, fairies without wings can still use magic, they can still perform spells, they just again have to contend with the lack of stamina and fatigue, and wings do grow back slowly over time. There are 8 fairy types that correspond to the 8 nature elements that I mentioned before. Each fairy type uses spells that are unique to their nature element, though there are some neutral spells that all fairies can use regardless of fairy type. These spells include, but are not limited to, opening and creating portals, teleportation, levitation, etc. And each fairy has different colored wings that correspond to their fairy type. Fairies of darkness have black wings, fire fairies have pale red wings, flora fairies have pale green wings, ice fairies have silver wings, earth fairies have pale orange wings, water fairies have pale blue wings, fairies of light have pale yellow wings, and storm fairies have pale purple wings. Today, I'm only going to go into the specifics of the fairy types that you will see in the first installment of Mission to Martius. These are flora fairies, fire fairies, fairies of light, and fairies of darkness. Something that I forgot to mention is that after the Human-Fairy War ended, Many fairies, and if not most fairies, resettled back in the Enchanted Cove, but there was also a significant amount of fairies who settled outside of the Enchanted Cove all across Renea in villages that either they founded or human villages or even human kingdoms. I already talked about flora fairies in episode 4 of the podcast, but in case you missed that, here's everything you need to know. So flora fairies have the unique ability to use healing magic and brew potions. This is why flora fairies are most frequently doctors and nurses. Healing magic allows flora fairies to manipulate oneself or another person or person's bodies for the purpose of healing. Flora fairies are able to heal by applying nature energy to wounds and injuries. Healing magic encompasses every medical procedure you can think of. Flora fairies can brew potions with medicinal herbs and administer them as pain relievers or anesthesias. They can perform surgeries, though the more complicated the surgery, the more magic that is required. I've previously noted that because humans don't naturally possess nature energy, their wounds can take longer to heal because nature energy has to be externally or internally applied, and that's what healing magic does. Fairies, by contrast, generally heal faster because their nature energy will automatically respond to the nature energy of the flora fairy that's doing the healing. It's also important to note that humans lacking nature energy makes them more resistant to offensive spells used by fairies during battle. This isn't always the case. It definitely depends on the nature of the spell, but this is something to keep in mind. This is why humans could be such lethal adversaries during the age of fairy hunters and during the human-fairy war, despite not having magic themselves. Offensively, flora fairies are able to grow oversized vines, trees, and roots to use against enemies. Also, with their ability to brew medicinal potions, they can also create poison. Notable flora fairies to know in Mission to Martius are Lily Griffin, who I mentioned before, Madame Rosemary Hyacinth, and Lily's parents, Primrose and Noah Lilith. Next, we have fire fairies. Fire fairies are best known for their combat-oriented spells. Offensively, they have fireballs, the ability to burn anything they touch at will. In collaboration with earth fairies, fire fairies can manipulate lava. There are even some fire fairies with the unique ability to use a sort of heat vision, though unlike healing for flora fairies, heat vision is a rare ability amongst fire fairies. Defensively, fire fairies can create firewalls as barriers, and while many fire fairies in the Enchanted Cove are soldiers, not all fire fairies use their magic for combat. Because there are so many everyday uses for fire, there are many fire fairies that are cooks, blacksmiths, and welders. Notable fire fairies to know are Cinder Ifrit and Madame Inferno Vulcan, both of which I will properly introduce in the next episode. Next, we have Fairies of Light. Fairies of Light, like fire fairies, are well regarded for their combat spells. Offensively, they are able to shoot rays of light, concentrate spheres of light magic in their hands, and use them as projectiles. They can blind their targets. Fairies of Light are also able to burn anything they touch at will, like fire fairies, although it takes more effort for them to do so. Fairies of Light are also known for their speed. In contrast to fire fairies, most fairies of light are, like most commonly, soldiers. There are fairies of light who are soldiers or combatants, but most are farmers or work in agriculture in some manner, often with water fairies, earth fairies, and or flora fairies. Notable fairies of light to know are Elaine Solis and Madame Lydia Helios, both of which I will properly introduce in the next episode. Next, we have Fairies of Darkness. Fairies of Darkness are a spoiler minefield, but I will do my best to give a general overview. So Fairies of Darkness are unique because many of their most well-known spells are forbidden. I'll discuss this more in the next episode when I talk about the inner workings of the Enchanted Cove, but Fairies in Renea are all about balance and maintaining the natural order of the world. Fairies of Darkness are known for their connection with the dead. They can see the spirits of the dead and feel the presence of the dead. Some can even commune with and summon the dead as mediums, things that may upset the balance of the world. Being a medium isn't inherently forbidden, and mediums actually make up a very small percentage of Fairies of Darkness because it is a very rare trait amongst Fairies of Darkness. It's some other abilities that mediums have that are like very forbidden that I cannot discuss, but just keep that in mind. But so fairies of darkness are also able to, this goes on to their less forbidden spells. They are able to manipulate shadows, they can travel through shadows, shadows can grant them a sense of invisibility. They're also able to cloak themselves by altering their physical appearances. They can create projectiles and vortexes that they use in battle. There isn't one singular occupation that fairies of darkness are particularly known for because of the nature of their spells, but most of the fairies of darkness that you will encounter in the story are soldiers or fighters in some regard. A fairy of darkness to note is Madame Tyra Gethin, who I will properly introduce in the next episode. Finally, I wanted to talk about the tree nymphs who I've not mentioned in this episode because they're a little different from fairies but still closely related. So while not technically classified as fairies, tree nymphs are most closely related to flora fairies, with their pale green wings and ability to grow oversized vines, trees, and roots. Tree nymphs are able to draw on the nature energy from trees as an external power source, thus they are strongest in wooded areas or around special trees imbued with magic, like the one at the center of the Enchanted Cove. This is something that I'll talk about more in the next episode, but essentially, at the center of the Enchanted Cove is this massive tree, and underneath the tree, underground, there is something known as the Orb of Control. The orb basically maintains the balance of nature energy across Renea, and so it's crucial that the orb is not disrupted because otherwise that will disrupt like all nature energy all across Renea. With the environment, with fairies, it would be very, very bad. So the story is that Alma created the tree nymphs with the sole purpose of protecting the tree that guards the orb. While all fairies generally play a role in protecting the Enchanted Cove, tree nymphs are often referred to as the guardians of the Enchanted Cove. The tree nymphs monitor the orb. They are the most attuned to the status of the orb and can feel when it's been disturbed. They can also stabilize the orb when it has been disturbed, though they can't fully control the orb's power and usually perform the stabilization in groups because, again, the orb is just exactly what it sounds like. It's this big, big ball of like concentrated energy. It's a lot of power. A tree nymph to note is Madame Ebony Diasporos, who I will properly introduce in the next episode. Alright, that is all I have for today's episode of the Mission and Martius podcast. Thank you guys so much for tuning in. I hope you guys enjoyed this episode. The next episode is coming out on October 23rd, and that is when I will dive into what the Enchanted Cove is like, as well as the Enchanted Cove Council. If you have any questions about Mission and Martius, feel free to leave them down below in the comments. I will do my best to answer them. Once again, thank you guys so much for listening to the Mission and Martius podcast, and I hope to see you guys in the next one. I'm gonna go rest my voice now. Bye, guys.